I want to appreciate everybody coming on to this live today. There are some very important things to discuss, and the title or theme of this discussion to you on today is White Power in Crisis. And we list some obvious places where this is occurring, like Minneapolis in the United States. And of course, it could span much of the United States. We look at what's happening in Colombia, which has captured the attention of people who really are concerned about the conflict that's happening in the streets there. Haiti, which is an ongoing crisis, and especially since sometime in April has escalated due to the current regime that's in power. We're looking at Brazil, where just a few days ago, police killed more than 25 African people. So throughout the world, there's evidence of this crisis, and Palestine is capturing the attention of many people today also. And we talk about this as a situation of a crisis of white power, because we want to address the fact that we're looking at a world order itself that is on a very shaky foundation. And we want to talk about a world order because many people who see what's happening in the United States and struggles and things like that, many people who see what's happening in Palestine and in places like Colombia and Haiti and Brazil as separate and distinctly different incidents. But that's not the case. You look at Chad, all over the continent of Africa. Look at Guadeloupe and various places throughout the Caribbean. Crisis abounds and people are engaged in very serious kinds of struggle. And the only reason that is not obvious is because it hadn't reached a proportion that that challenges the ability of it to be controlled in isolation by the colonial capitalist forces of the world. But I just wanted to say some things about this. And so I see Comrade Rene Nassar and Diop Ulukpala and Penny Hess. Just want to say, Uhuru comrades, I see you there. And I'm glad to see that you're involved in this discussion. In Colombia, the protest has started on April 28th. And the immediate basis for the protests were the increased proposed tax increases on basic public services and pay wages and pensions and things like that. And so the people have been engaged in a real serious fight back against this government. But you need to understand Colombia is more than just that place. Colombia is headquarters to a really serious aggression that the United States government is making against the people, not only in Colombia, but in that region, particularly Venezuela, that borders Colombia, where the U.S. government has initiated sometimes actual military incursions through the Colombian armies, et cetera, and where military forces from Colombia that acquires a tremendous amount of money from the United States government for what they call military aid, but it's really arming Colombian forces to be a part of its army against peoples, not only in South America, but around the world. And Colombia, as many of you know, was headquarters to much of the aggression against the Venezuelan government. This traitor, Guido, from Venezuela, who the United States government picked as the president of Venezuela, despite the fact that the people had chosen somebody else, had elected their president in the form of Maduro. That he was hosted in Colombia. He was brought to the Colombian Venezuelan border, where he was to make some dramatic entry into Venezuela with the hope by the U.S. government and other imperialist forces that Venezuela in dealing with him would create a situation that would allow even more direct intervention by the United States government. So this is an ongoing struggle that the people have been making against Colombia. Colombia is the headquarter reaction. About a quarter of the population in Colombia are African people, and African people are really at the center of much of the protests and much of the repression that's happening in Colombia right now. And a very important aspect of the struggle that's happening in Colombia that's not stated so much is the collective land area that was turned over to African people for our use there. And increasingly, what we see is that elements taken that from the Colombian government is facilitating the ability of forces, their economic interests to take that land. So our people engage in a serious struggle around that land. It has enhanced the militancy of our people in Colombia. And there's much more that can be said about Colombia. You know, Panama used to be a part of Colombia. The United States fostered a struggle in there, created or certainly facilitated the existence of some Panamanian force that was fighting for quote unquote independence from Colombia, and allowed the United States government to create a situation of support for those forces that permitted the United States to build the Panama Canal, which is what it was that they wanted to, that was going to make tremendous amount of resources, economic resources by joining the Atlantic and making it possible for moving goods and things like that through that canal to the Atlantic Ocean. So Colombia is in play now, and the people are very serious, and the contradictions and the struggle seem to be deepening on a regular basis. And Colombia had one of the longest lasting revolutionary movements, military guerrilla movements in the world for a while. And a few years ago, a peace was negotiated, and the revolutionaries came in, and many of them are being assassinated on a regular basis in Colombia, despite the fact there's supposed to be some kind of peace there, and especially when they've tried to participate in the electoral process and running for office. So Colombia is in play. And then people have had to notice as well the crisis that perhaps revolved around Brazil. One of the things about Brazil most recently is that about a week or so ago, Brazilian police killed like 25 African people on a single day. And this is, it captured a ruling class of colonial capitalist media in the world and in this country. But the fact is that that's a traditional treatment of our people in Brazil, especially children. Brazilian police have been killing children on a regular basis, many of whom are homeless, have no place to live, and they're living in the streets. And in fact, they're often characterized as street children. The Brazilian police have been killing them with impunity. And so they claim that Brazil has a population of about 56%, that's 6% or so African. But the reality is that there are many more Africans in Brazil. It's one of the places in terms of the political state with the largest group of Africans in the world. And the Africans catch hell there, and especially those who are identified as African, because Brazil, while it likes to pretend that there's no racial problem or issue in Brazil, and many Africans who are Brazilians have been able and have said that in the past too, it's because of how Brazil has structured the whole discussion. And what has happened, of course, is, you know, Brazil was enslaved, colonized by the Portuguese. And what the Portuguese did very cleverly was to appropriate African culture and call it Brazilian and call themselves Brazilians as well. And so the obvious distinction in the brains of many people that people refer to as racism has not been so prevalent in the brains of people, and so many people call themselves Brazilians and deny that there is such a thing as they characterize as "quote unquote" race. That was certainly true in the recent past, but increasingly more and more more and more people are identifying themselves as Africans in Brazil. And this huge struggle in terms of the level of everything determined by how folk are identified in terms of healthcare, in terms of job and high paying jobs and educational attainment and things like that. So this is a consequence of African people living in this situation in Brazil. And in 2018, this guy was elected, whose name is Jair Bolsonaro, who on the campaign trail, he was comparing African people to cattle and said that that don't even serve to procreate. It's a very difficult situation for African people who are there, and for African people are isolated in many different ways in Brazil because of language. Because in Brazil, the language is Portuguese, while they're surrounded by people who are speaking Spanish. And on the other side, on North America, of course, English-speaking Africans. So that's part of what we're looking at. But there's ongoing resistance that's happening in Brazil right now. And I think it's important for us to recognize that. In the meantime, our people are still being poisoned in Guadeloupe and Martinique and French colonies. In 2021, French has colonies in the Caribbean. And two of them are Guadeloupe and Martinique. And they have used this chemical called chlordecone as a pesticide to protect the produce, agricultural products that they are developing, commodities that they're developing in these areas. And it has led to a lot of people dying, prostate cancer, and a lot of African people, children who are born deformed and things like that, having all kinds of issues. And that's under French colonialism. And there's an element of isolation that's experienced by African people who are in Martinique and Guadeloupe and French-speaking territories. And part of this is, again, because of French being the language there, and they're surrounded in most instances by people who either speak English or who speak Spanish. Again, depending on which colonizer brought us into different places of the world and dominated us, we suffered these kinds of contradictions. In Chad, since late April, people have been in the streets demonstrating, trying to have civilian rule, at minimum, returned there. In Senegal, since mid-April, there have been protests, mobilizations in Congo, a huge escalation of attacks by armed groups on people to fight and maintain the status quo, that illegitimate government that's been put there. And of course, every government in Congo has been there, been illegitimate since the U.S., the French, the Belgians collaborated to murder Patrice Lumumba, who was elected as prime minister in Congo, the first post-colonial, that's even a bad term, but prime minister in Congo, and he was murdered as a part of a process of killing off the Black Revolution of the 1960s. And so I'm mentioning all of these things because I know many people are accustomed to seeing these as different incidents. And this is not even the tip of the iceberg of what's going on. I didn't even talk much about what's happening in the United States, or the 10,000 or more mobilization that happened just last year alone, demonstration, protest, uprising, due to the murder of George Floyd on May 25th of 2020. and in a 3-month period, something like more than 10,000 mobilizations. Even as we're having this discussion today, African people are demonstrating and protesting and opposing much of how the U.S. government is moving, and there's an obvious move to place restrictions on anything that approximates freedom for Black people in this country, even pushing back on gains that Africans thought that they had won in terms of voting rights, things like that, in terms of civil rights, even in many states in the United States. There are 50 states in the United States. More than 40 of them have either initiated or involved in discussions of making protests illegal in the United States, so that they create a situation where they can kill and maim and take away anything that looks like freedom, and then make it illegal to protest what it is they're doing. The whole assault that's happening in the United States and much of the world around what they used to refer to as free speech. In fact, we're going to be lucky if I can get through this presentation without the colonial capitalist owners of this platform shutting it down because of what I say, what they interpret the meaning of what I say to be. And this is really interesting because again, we're talking about the crisis of white power. We're talking about the crisis of a system. We're talking about a world order that's experiencing a state of crisis today. And you think about a country like the United States that used to brag about this thing they call free speech, and even have had legal professionals or people who supposedly, uphold the greatest ideas about the Constitution and democratic rights. They used to say how unpopular speech is the most speech that needs to be protected more than any speech. And they used to talk about how there should be freedom speech, an open market for ideas, and like the best idea prevail. That used to be the language that you would hear, but you don't hear that anymore. Today, what they do is use any method, any reason, any excuse to shut down any kind of discussion because it speaks to the fragility of a system that exists today. It is fragile, and they could have free speech as long as people were so oppressed that they couldn't use it or wouldn't use what might be characterized as free speech. They talked about free speech, but they were killing Emmett Till for whistling. They said at a white woman. They had a situation where African people were even terrified to make any statements. They knew that, or we knew, that any white man could kill us with impunity. So the notion of free speech has always been a trick, a joke, but today it's such that they were actually cut off and do cut off speech. They call it hate speech. Anything that defies the traditions of colonial domination and that's opposed, that's spoken to, they're characterized as hate speech and shut it down. And so, hopefully I'll be able to get through this presentation without that happening. But what I wanted to say, and the reason we embrace all of these things, what's happening in the United States, the fact that voting rights are under assault, the fact that free speech under assault in the United States, the fact that what we see happening in places like Colombia and Congo, what we see happening even in Iraq right now, where people are protesting and being killed by armed thugs in Iraq. This is even after the United States government has gone in and overthrown a government and lynched the president of that government. So they have not been able to stabilize that situation. Almost everything they do has worked against them. So we're talking about a world order that's fraying. And this is part of what I really want to convey. Because the system that we are looking at came into existence. It wasn't something that was given to the world. It wasn't in the Bible that one day the white man would dominate the world, white power would dominate the world, that America would dominate the world. It wasn't there. In fact, there was no such thing as America until the last few hundred years. And most of what has come to be known as Europe came into existence in the last few hundred years as well. So it's not like there was something natural and normal about the arrangement, or is normal and natural about the arrangement that we see in the world. Where did it come from? Before we saw this attack by Europe on Africa that initiated what was called the slave trade, which is colonial capitalism. That's where it came from, colonial capitalism. Before then, all of Europe lived under feudal domination. And feudalism saw these little enclaves, these little fiefdoms, if you will, and that's come to be known as France and Germany and several other these fiefdoms existing there with their own little economies and their own little armies and their own little relationships to each other. Sometimes they fought and killed each other. Sometimes they had some temporary peace among themselves, but they were different entities. But what happened was when Portugal went into Africa and initiated the capture of African people for sale and initiated what became to be known as colonialism, it linked the whole world up into a single economy. That's world economy. It was characterized in many ways, defined by what was called the triangular trade, where they were trading African people around the world. People had traded around the world before now, but the world was not hooked up into a single system, economic system. This is what we talk about when we talk about a world order. It is this system. It was a colonial system that gave rise to capitalism. That's why we call it colonial capitalism. It is capitalism that came about as a consequence of empire, of these imperial forces leaving Europe, leaving an impoverished and diseased Europe and traveling out to Africa in particular. And when you look at how the world looks today, much of it has been determined by what has happened to Africa and African people. Even when you look at what's called South America, Latin America, these were colonies that were really important to Europe because of the trade in African people who have been captured and who've been dispersed there to work and create wealth and value that went into what we now know as the capitalist system to create the world order as we know it. So it's a world order. And even though people in different places of the world have never seen the U.S. and never seen different places around the world, we're all connected in this world economy. It's a world order that we are dealing with. Somebody once said that freedom, real freedom, is recognition of necessity. And when you talk about necessity, because most people have understood what that means, real freedom is recognition of necessity. And what is necessity? That defines all human societies. And that necessity is to produce and reproduce life. If you don't have life, you have nothing. You have no culture. You have nothing. And so it is this process that human beings are engaged in, producing, reproducing life, reproducing ourselves as a species, reproducing and enhancing our ability to produce the necessities of life, food, clothing, and shelter, with this becoming more efficient on a regular basis in terms of the development. That's necessity that we're talking about. But when Europe attacked Africa, and after a short period of time, Africa no longer created life for ourselves. We created life for Europe and for the white world. And it is this white world, it is that's experiencing crisis today all around the world, because everything we look at is a part of the same social system, the same political economy that it's global. It's not just something that exists in one place in the world. It's global. It doesn't just exist in Chad. It doesn't just exist in some of the other places. It's global. It's a global social system. And if you understand that, then you understand what it takes for us to win. You understand the absolute need for us to have relationships with other oppressed peoples around the world. You understand the fact that this global social system, this world order, has no validity, not for us. And that what we have to do is recognize the significance of all these forces that play in the world. Colombia, that we talked about, Chad, that we talked about, Mali, where struggle is going on, Senegal, where struggle is going on, Palestine, Pakistan, all of these places where people are trying to break out of the system. They're trying to break out of a system that came into existence through the process of enslaving Africa and African people. That's what's important for us to understand. So I want to say, All of that is true. But I want to speak right now more specifically to what's happening in Palestine. And I want to say what's happening in Palestine more specifically, not as a way of negating not speaking to issues happening to other oppressed people, and certainly not evading what's happening to African people. Because I am convinced that African revolution is the key to overturning the whole social system of exploitation and oppression of all the peoples of the world, and certainly of the toiling masses of the world. It's centered in the struggle of Africa and African people. We are key to it. And we're not key to it as Africans in New Jersey, or Africans in Louisiana, or Africans in Haiti, or Africans in any of these other distinct specific places, but as a part of an African nation that has been forcibly dispersed around the world. We're key to it. So I'm not trying to say anything that negates that significance. I'm just saying, here's the world that we live in. Africa and African people have been critical to its creation, but there are other factors, there are other components of it that at any given time represent critical points that we need to attack, we need to struggle with. Colombia is one of them right now. Haiti is one of them. Brazil is one of them. But I want to speak about Palestine. I want to speak about what's happening in Palestine because this is a kind of murder that happens in broad daylight that everybody in the world is aware of right now. And it happens in broad daylight, and most of the foreign powers of the world are apologists for this murder of Palestinian Arab people. In some places, they have to at least pretend that they support oppressed people, depending on how that struggle is unfolded. But that's not true in occupied Palestine. That's what it is, occupied Palestine. It is an entity that is referred to as Israel. It's called Israel because you had a situation where Europeans left Europe, just like they left Europe to come to this land that we call America, just like they left Europe to go to that land that we call Australia, just like they left Europe and went to that land that they call New Zealand and went to what they call Rhodesia, and they call South Africa. And Europeans left Europe for the same reason. Because this is the way to get a whole bunch of resources to build what you never could have had before. And especially if you have to compete with other capitalists in order to get it, then the best way to do is find your own place of colonialism, just find your own territory to steal, your own people to oppress. And that's what happened. Europeans left Europe and went to Palestine. And they attacked the Palestinian Arabs and took their land and changed the name of the land from Palestine and called it Israel and call themselves Israelis. And now they pretend they've always been there, and they claim that Israel is a territory. This Israel they're talking about was given to them by God 4,000 years ago. So they've turned what many people would characterize as their God into a real estate deal that's given them the land of the Palestinian people. And this is something that happened at the end of the Ottoman Empire. And you had France and England in particular, but the US involved too, and drawing the borders of what we now know as the Middle East. That's where Saudi Arabia came from. That's where the current existence of Lebanon came from, the current iteration. That's where you see Syria and all these other entities have been defined in terms of their modern borders coming at the end of that war. The end of 1919, at the end of the first imperialist war after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. So this place, Palestine, and you know what was happening in Europe. The Europeans were killing other Europeans who were known as Jews. And this thing that we talk about today around fascism and the rise of the Nazis, etc., came about and really punctuated this murder that was happening to Jewish people in Europe. Was no Palestinian Arabs killing them, was no Africans killing them. It was Europeans killing these Europeans who were Jews. And so you had this group of entrepreneurs, if you will, who saw an opportunity to steal some land in concert with the existing imperial powers. They looked at Uganda at one time. They wanted to make that the national homeland for the Jews, and they settled on Palestine. And they went into Palestine, and before this, there were Arabs, there were Arab Muslims, Arab Jews, and Arab Christians who lived in this place, Palestine. But they claimed it for themselves. And with the assistance of England and various other powers, they attacked the people. They began to murder people. They were bombing mosques and things like that, killing people, chasing them out of their land and claiming the land for their own. This is the history of that relationship. So there was no such thing as Israel until 1948. 1948, they claimed the existence of the state of Israel that was recognized right away by certain imperial powers, including the United States. So here you have this entity, May 15, 1948, the state of Israel. And it was not something that the Palestinian Arabs accepted peacefully. In fact, they fought to try to keep their land and to keep their territory and to keep everything that had come to them as a consequence of a heritage of being Palestinian Arabs. And now we find that after successfully taking all of the land that was once Palestine, all of this land, we call it occupied Palestine, all of it. After taking this land, now they have beaten back the Palestinian resistance to a point where the leadership of the Palestinian struggle at one point, at least a sector of it, just claimed, just give us 20%. We'll be satisfied with 20% of the land that's been stolen from us. And they fought for more than that. They fought to get everything they could. They were isolated. They were slandered. They were every kind of effort that was made, that was possible, was made to isolate the Palestinian people and to take their land. And they fought in many ways almost alone. They ended up, in fact, having to rely on these reactionary Arab states that worked hand in glove in general with the imperialist power, from Saudi Arabia to the United Arab Emirates, to all of them reactionary states. And they made various kinds of contributions to what was called the Palestinian Liberation Movement. The PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, was born out of that. And the Palestinian Liberation Organization was comprised of different fronts of the Palestinian movement and different formations, organizations with different understanding about what freedom meant. And the one group, Fatah, which was headed by a man named Yasser Arafat, was the so-called moderate, which is to say that he was a Palestinian that was willing to make a struggle, even armed struggle, for the recapture of Palestine. Well, with the limited objective of taking Palestine, but not overturning the kind of social system that Palestinians would have to endure and live in. And so, but even so, he became a hero to the Palestinian people. And the United States and the state of Israel worked everything they could to get rid of him, and finally they succeeded in getting rid of Arafat. They actually first, after several attempts to murder him, once holding him hostage, and then another occasion after that didn't succeed, forcing him into having elections within Palestine and what they call a Palestinian Authority, trying to make him restructure the Palestinian Authority in a fashion that they were sure would undermine his ability to head that entity that they call the I guess the incipient Palestinian state, and they failed in that. And when they couldn't do that, and Arafat still maintained control, they poisoned him, they killed him. And you should understand this, because you have today this claim by the United States and England and other countries that the Russians poisoned some sellout Russian, and they do everything they can to undermine Russia because of that. But here, clearly Arafat was murdered, was killed. And so this ongoing war that's been made against the Palestinian people, to the point that we saw that I'm struggling with this because there's so much that needs to be said about this, and I can't say all of it. But the fact is that they split up the what was to be the Palestinian territories into two entities separated from each other. They are not even contiguous. One, the so-called West Bank, where Fatah is now the power, and the other that we talk about is the Gaza Strip, where Hamas, the organization Hamas, which is an Islamic-based organization, heads the state. And that's because that after Israel and the U.S. and the others pushed for elections in occupied Palestine that they assumed would be won by Fatah. Fatah lost the election and Hamas won the elections. And then the U.S. and Israel instigated this war between Hamas and Fatah that worked hand in glove with the United States and Israel. And so now there's a situation that it ended with Hamas being able to take control of the Gaza Strip, which is where all kinds of murder is happening today against the Palestinian people, and where the resistance is most intense against the Israeli-U.S. collaborated attack on the rights and freedoms of the people of Palestine. That's why one of the reasons that you must hate and know just how disingenuous this faint-hearted response or to Donald Trump's so-called wall separating Mexico from the occupied sector of Mexico is because all over occupied Palestine, those walls have been created by the illegitimate white nationalist state of Israel. These walls have been there, and that's what you have to do when you are a settler colony, which is what Israel is. It's a settler colony, which is what the United States is. It's a settler colony. In order to keep the people from their lands and their territories, these walls become necessary, and extreme oppression is necessary. So most recently, because this guy Netanyahu has facing a real contest in the elections, and because he himself is facing all kinds of charges, criminal charges that at least in theory could see him going to jail. We see this initiation of a contradiction, a conflict between the people, Arab people in the Gaza Strip, and the illegitimate settler colony. It's a really nasty white nationalist settler colony, nasty, nasty, nasty. It has the same kind of attitudes about Palestinians that we see happening with the attitude by Mississippi crackers against Africans and other forces like that against black people globally. This is the attitude, how colonialism functions, because colonialism has to treat the colonizer, has to treat the colonized as the other, and has to define us in a fashion that murder, mayhem, the worst kinds of offenses against humanity can be created with impunity and could be, and the world would say it's all right. Like here in Palestine, every time you've seen hundreds of Israeli U.S. purchased airplanes, warplanes, and munitions dropped on the people of Palestine. And when you read about it on the Gaza Strip, is what we're talking about. When you read about it in the colonial capitalist media, they say that it was in response or retaliation to something that was done by Hamas or done by some Palestinian that made them come out with all of those bombs and drone missiles and things like that to kill them. And it's like somebody breaks into your house and you use a brick to try to chase them out of your house. And they come with machine guns and they come with Apache helicopters and rocket launchers to destroy you. And you can claim that because they threw rocks after I stole a house, which is no longer mentioned, you can claim that it was in retaliation. It was in response to rock throwing that we did this. This is the kind of setup that they have. They create this entity, this system of oppression, and the people and they legalize it. They legalize it because the state legalizes itself. If the Israeli state comes in, takes power, takes the people land, define that Palestine is no longer Palestine, but is now Israel, define themselves as Israel, has come up with an Israeli constitution, decide who is an Israeli citizen and things like that. They are the ones who say what's legal and what's illegal. And they said that fighting against them is illegal and holding them and using every means possible is legal and justified. That's the kind of situation that we're looking at. So in Palestine, just over the last few days, we've seen so many Palestinian Arabs are being murdered. There have been, they talk about perhaps close to 50 Palestinian Arabs being killed in Gaza Strip, where they again are using warplanes, bombs, and things like that to kill people. And they say that the Palestinians in retaliation have killed something like, I think they said 7, maybe 12 Israelis as a part of that struggle. And it's really an important discussion for us to have, because if you look at Gaza, there are 2 million people in Gaza. They're crammed together in something that could be likened to an alley. 2 million people crammed together by this colonial state of Israel on a strip of land that is only 25 miles long and about 5 miles wide. And this is where the people are being bombed. This is where they're being starved to death. And this is where the resistance is happening in broad daylight, and the majority of the world is watching this, but you don't see much happening in terms of stopping it. You don't hear any meaningful protests, except that increasingly there are some of them who begin to, that is to say, the colonial capitalists, who worry about how this war that Israel is making against the Palestinian people will destabilize the entire Middle East. And so that's the problem. Let me just say this. Palestine was important to the colonial capitalists of the world. It was important because they wanted the petroleum there. The petroleum in mostly Arab-controlled territories, even though white power created the borders that most of the Arabs live in, the fact is that most of the petroleum is located there. And even though they have reactionaries who were in their pockets, who they control more or less, that presided over these states, these states in the Middle East, they couldn't trust them. They couldn't trust them because the people themselves, and any given day, may overthrow these reactionary Arabs and create a state that speaks to their own interests as people. And so in order to make sure that they were going to be able to control that, they put these white people there and who were not Arabs. And on the other side, of course, they in the Persian Gulf, they had tried to do the same thing with the Shah of Iran, who also, you're looking at somebody who's not Arab. So the assumption was that they armed the Shah to the teeth. You gave him all kinds of weaponry and things like that to help be a part of their defense apparatus over the Persian Gulf, the oil there, and the whole Middle East, and also a threat to African movement in parts of Africa, especially North Africa. In this instance, you have this illegitimate white nationalist state of Israel. And it is a white nationalist state. It is a white state. And because it is that, they felt they could rely on this entity to protect the interests of white power when it comes to oil, petroleum, or any other thing politically there. So that's one of the reasons it was important for them to do that. And I can't even begin to tell you about the poverty, the oppression, exploitation that's happening to Palestinian Arabs. And I know that my statements about this are being compromised by the fact that in many places where we live outside of the Middle East, certainly like in the United States, and there are other places where I assume it might be true as well, we find that Palestinians who have come to the United States as refugees, because most of the Palestinians have been pushed out of Palestine and they live in refugee situations, sometimes in refugee camps, when they've been there all their lives, born in refugee camps, live in refugee camps, dispersed around the Middle East, and they've come to other places around the world, including the United States. When they come to the United States, even though they've been catching hell and oppressed in occupied Palestine or by the state of Israel, they come to the United States at the expense often of African people. They are able to set up shops and things like that in our communities. They have resources that we don't have. And they often treat African people in the same way that the Israelis treat them in Palestine, in occupied Palestine. They are impolite to African women. They sell garbage in their shops. This is what we have to contend with. And their attitudes toward African people reflects the same attitude that we find with white power globally. And so because of this, we find some Africans who say, the hell with the Palestinians, that I don't want to support them or them Arabs, as they're often referred to. But the fact of the matter is this, that we're talking about a social system itself. And that just because somebody is a Palestinian doesn't mean that they are righteous, doesn't mean that they will be on the right side of the history. And especially if you run into a Palestinian from the Middle East in your neighborhood, that's not some poor Palestinian who got to your neighborhood. They didn't get there by hitchhiking or something like that. They had enough resources to get them here. They had enough connections to be able to open up shops in your own community, because the rulers in this country, and I'm talking now about the United States, want them to have those shops in this community where you live at, because they function as a kind of buffer. They also function as somebody who, like many of the others who came to the United States, they have a better life here than they had where they came from. African people in this country, the indigenous people in this country, are the only people who didn't come to this country looking for a better way of life. We lost a better way of life as a consequence of getting here. So you have the ability, and not run into it, Palestinians to make speeches talking about freedom for Palestine, etc., and trying to define the United States as this wonderful place. We've had to stop being in protest with these Palestinians who talked about how the United States is this wonderful place and that therefore they should have freedom. And how can you be on a platform standing next to me? You, an Arab, came here more or less because you wanted to come and looking for a better way of life. And I am an Arab African who was brought here against my will, who created the ability for you to even have this better way of life that you're talking about. So that's a profound contradiction, and I know that. But the point that I'm making is that the whole system itself is rotten and foul. And that when we see what's happening throughout the Middle East, when we see what's happening throughout the world, we're looking at a system that's in a state of fracture, that is falling apart, it's being torn asunder and what have you. We celebrate that. We support the Palestinians in their struggle to retake their land. And we send real solidarity. When the rebellions broke out in the United States in 2014, after the murder of Mike Brown in St. Louis, Ferguson, St. Louis, you saw messages coming from Palestinians who was expressing solidarity, giving instructions of how to deal with the tear gas, just because of their own experience dealing with tear gas and things like that. So that kind of solidarity was there. We have had at different times, that is to say, we, the African People's Socialist Party, close relationships with Palestinian revolutionaries from who many of them were in the United States. We had relationships with them, and their objective was to destroy this kind of global economy, this world order that all of us have been trapped by. So as an African internationalist, as a revolutionary, I'm saying that all of what we see happening in the world today, in Chad, in Mali, in Senegal, in Uganda, in Congo, in Libya, in Palestine, all of these other places that we've adopted, Colombia, in Venezuela, and the people standing up to fight back. All of this is evidence of a crisis of a whole social system. Unfortunately, many of us don't see the connection between them. We know that we are, in talking general terms, fighting against imperialism and stuff like that, but do not recognize the existence of a colonial capitalist world economy, a world system that's hung together through this colonial enterprise that dominates the world and has dominated the world for the last 500 years or so. Because most of us find ourselves, or most trying to find our own freedom without taking into consideration the implications of the struggles of other peoples around the world have for making that freedom and changing this world that we live in. The African People's Socialist Party, we understand that we have to be victorious. One, as African people, we want every square inch of Africa, we want it back. We want everything you've stolen from Africa back. When I say everything you've stolen from Africa, part of what you've stolen from Africa is in Guadeloupe, in Martinique, it's in Houston, Texas, it's in England, and all these other places. We want it all back. Those are resources that should be the property of Africa. And we want to wage this struggle to destroy a social system that would celebrate slavery and colonialism and celebrate the kind of murder that this government is doing to peoples all around the world. We want the end of that system. That's why we have a political party that has been created for that purpose. And so that's why we exist as a political party. In Africa, we exist as a political party in the United States, in Europe, and in the Caribbean and South America, because the system has to go and because we have to have a concerted, united struggle to overturn this system. That's what it is that we are doing. That's what it is that we are about. And we also say that for this to happen, you can have an organization of Boy Scouts or a Glee Club people. This has to be an organization, revolutionary organization, a revolutionary organization that is consolidated around a revolutionary theory, like African internationalism, that has to have revolutionary discipline, that has to be a revolutionary organization with this objective of overturning this kind of social system and giving power to the African working class and to the mass of workers of the world. So that's what we are about. And so they are wreaking havoc in various places around the world, but it's a state of crisis that's pushing them to do this. They can't run, they can't govern in the same old way. People are fighting back, people are resisting, even if they are not conscious of having revolutionary objectives. People are resisting every place. And that is what it is that we must continue to do. But now we must also be giving the leadership to this resistance. Give organization to this resistance. Give ideological direction to this resistance. That's what the African People's Socialist Party is all about. And we must have dedicated, disciplined cadre to carry out the mission of liberating Africa, uniting Africa and African people around the world, building the revolutionary project that will result in the emancipation of all the toiling masses of the world and all the colonized people who live under terror as a regular condition of existence under this world order that came about through colonial slavery. Uhuru, APSP, uhuru.org. Uhuru.